Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. It began with good intentions that my husband Michael had a demanding job at a tech startup. One late Friday evening, just as the sky dimmed and I'd finished preparing dinner, his phone buzzed with a text. Two of his colleagues, Sarah and Jason, were stranded in the city. Their hotel reservation fell through, and with no other options, they asked if they could stay at our place for the weekend. They were exhausted, stressed, and he pleaded with me to let them stay. I agreed, without hesitation. Hospitality felt natural, and after 6 years of marriage, I trusted Michael. I trusted him to maintain boundaries. They arrived late, luggage in tow, fatigue evident in their eyes. Jason was polite, awkward around a stranger's home. Sarah was warm, friendly, the kind of person who immediately made me feel at ease. I showed them to the guest room, offered coffee, extra towels. Then I retreated. Michael insisted he'd stay with them only briefly just to help settle them. I believed him. At first, the weekend felt normal. I cooked extra meals. We laughed around. The dinner table, 4 people, shared stories, board games. I saw friendly camaraderie between my husband and his coworkers. At no time did I sense tension. At no time did I doubt my decision. Then things shifted. Imperceptibly at first, Michael said he'd join me for coffee upstairs, but delayed coming. I wandered into the guest room to see if they needed anything. Sarah was sitting on the bed, propped by pillows, reading quietly. She smiled. "Thanks for letting us stay," she said softly. Then Jason peeked in shy and murmured his thanks. As well, that small moment struck me with unexpected warmth. I felt appreciated. I felt somehow more than a hostess. I felt needed. Later, I caught Michael and Sarah lingering in the kitchen. The brief greeting stretched into a conversation too. Close for comfort. Words exchanged over cooking wine. I watched from the doorway for a second, long enough to see their eyes meet with a depth I couldn't dismiss. My blood ran cold. But I told myself it was paranoia. Still, boundaries loosened. On Saturday night, they all offered to help clean up. After dinner, I was in the doorway, wiping counter crumbs. Michael turned off the lights upstairs, and instead of going up to join me, he stood beside the dishwasher. Sarah leaned in to rinse a plate, their hands brushed. A charged silence. I didn't speak. I turned away. That night, they didn't leave. They didn't return to the guest room. I went to bed later, hearing muted conversation in the living room. Michael slept beside me, but I couldn't sleep. I wondered what was mutably happening in the dark. Then came Sunday morning. I was in the kitchen brewing coffee when Sarah came out of the guest room in Michael's shirt. He hadn't worn it. She smiled at me, a bit too knowingly. She invited me upstairs for breakfast. Confused, I hesitated. She pulled back the curtain to let sunshine in and said, "It's beautiful up there." I followed. The bedroom was quiet. Sarah already sat on the bed, legs folded, reading a book. Michael was seated with a laptop, absorbed. I felt like a guest in my own home. They invited me to breakfast toast, coffee, conversation again. But I noticed soft jokes at my expense. Why so tense? Michael said, Sarah gave me a look. "You're a good host, but you'd relax more with wine." I handled it with grace, smiling politely. Inside, I felt a growing ache. After breakfast, they said they'd call the hotel again. They lingered. I watched them. Michael talking with Jason over software problems, Sarah leaning into his conversation, gently touching his arm for emphasis. That was the moment I realized I'd let them stay. And in doing so, I'd let boundaries slip. And maybe I was okay with it. There was nostalgia in the attention, in being surrounded by people noticing me, appreciating me. On Sunday afternoon, I made tea and invited Sarah alone to chat. She accepted politely, but then asked about my marriage if Michael was making me happy. She didn't hide her concern. She admitted she and Michael had talked late at night about me, my kindness, my cooking, my warmth. I felt conflicting emotions. Flattered, unsettled, suspicious. I confronted her carefully. Did anything happen? She looked away, then said, I don't want to hurt you, but feelings can happen. That answer broke something in me. I confronted Michael that night. He was defensive, then apologetic, then admitting he felt drawn to Sarah's vulnerability too. He told me they talked about me, how good I was to host them, how she complimented me to him, and that made him feel proud but also guilty. But somehow the guilt mixed with something else, something intoxicating. That was the start of it. Monday morning. They were supposed to leave, but Michael said their calls failed again. They'd still be here another night. I didn't stop. Then, that evening, everyone had wine. Conversation floated. The boundary had dissolved. The three of them sat close on the living room couch. I joined them briefly, but lingered in the corner, watching. I felt like a character in someone else's house observing. Later, I found myself in the guest room again. Sarah apologized for stretching the stay. She said, I think it's better if I leave early tomorrow. We talked. We cried. She said she wished boundaries had stayed intact. I felt tears at her empathy and despair. That night, Michael came to bed late. I confronted him again. He kissed me almost tenderly and said, I'm lost. He didn't leave. He reached for my hand and we slept there in silence. But together, in the morning, Sarah and Jason left suddenly. Michael insisted driving them. They didn't say goodbye to me proper. I waited in the kitchen until I heard engines. The house felt empty in a new way. I shed tears, but couldn't tell if it was relief or grief. Months passed. The memory of that weekend haunted me, not for logical betrayal, but for emotional abandonment. Michael was ashamed, apologetic, tender, but the pull had been real. He begged me for trust. We did counseling. The counselor said the betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional territory ceded in my presence. We rebuilt slowly. I stopped hosting so willingly. Hospitality felt painful. Our dinners had fewer guests. I watched Michael more closely, but not with suspicion anymore. With a sadness that love could be confusing. Sarah and Jason became ghost sex left unread. I deleted their numbers. We learned painful lessons. That intimacy can build outside marriage, even without love. That boundaries matter. That the simplest kindness, hospitality can be misread or misused when the underlying currents shift. We're together now. Michael is repentant and present. We rebuilt our connection. Slow dinners, honest talks, clear boundaries for guests, for colleagues. The betrayal wasn't physical, but the line felt crossed. I let them stay. And in doing so, I let something fragile slip. And that cost a chapter of trust we may never fully recover, but we learned to carry together. After Sarah and Jason left, the silence in our house was suffocating. Not the peaceful kind of silence you enjoy with someone you love, the kind that wraps you in comfort, but a heavy, awkward quiet that made every footstep echo too loudly. Every creak of the floorboard feel accusatory. Michael didn't talk much that day. He sat on the couch with his head in his hands for hours. I busied myself with chores I didn't need to do, rearranging bookshelves, folding already folded laundry just to avoid sitting in the same room with him. I didn't know what I would say if I did. I didn't know what I wanted to hear. That evening, he came into the kitchen as I was wiping down the already clean counter and said, softly, I messed everything up, didn't I? I didn't answer because I didn't know if I wanted to hurt him or hold him. I wasn't innocent in all this either. I let it happen. I saw the way Sarah looked at him, the way he responded to her, and I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that if I smiled enough, if I made everyone comfortable, I could control the situation. But some things don't respond to politeness. Some things creep in quietly, waiting for you to pretend they're not real until it's too late. We started therapy a week later. Michael set it up without me asking. I think he was desperate to fix it, or at least to feel like he was trying. I wasn't sure I was ready to forgive, but I went anyway. The therapist was calm, neutral. She asked the hard questions first. What happened? What didn't happen? What were the boundaries? When were they crossed? At what point did feelings get involved? Michael admitted more than I expected. He told her that Sarah made him feel important, energized, that talking to her felt easy in a way our conversations hadn't in a while, that it reminded him of a version of himself he missed, a version before bills and long hours and the weight of domestic life. I didn't cry, I just nodded. Because I understood. That was the worst part, I understood it. I'd felt the same thing. Not toward Jason or Sarah, but just in general a yearning for something that made me feel awake again. The therapist asked me if I felt betrayed. I said yes. Not because Michael had kissed anyone he swore he hadn't, and I believed him, but because he had offered pieces of himself to someone else that used to be mine. His laughter, his attention, his time, his trust that we talked, week after week, about what it meant to rebuild something that was cracked but not completely shattered. Michael became different after that, softer, more present. He started asking how I was not just in passing, but really asking. He cooked more, sat with me even when I was silent. He held me without asking for anything in return. But trust doesn't come back all at once. There were days I'd see him check his phone and my stomach would drop. Nights when I couldn't sleep and would replay the entire weekend in my head, wondering if there were things I still didn't know. Wondering if Sarah thought about him the way I did every hour, every moment. We didn't speak her name anymore. It was a silent agreement. Jason faded from the picture even faster. Michael told his boss they couldn't work together anymore, requested a project change. They granted it. I never asked what he told them. Months passed, small rituals became lifelines, cooking dinner together, walking around the block after work, watching documentaries we'd never normally choose, just to have something to discuss that wasn't us. There was a night in early spring when we sat on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket, and I said, out of nowhere, I don't know if I'll ever completely trust you again. He nodded. I don't know if I completely trust myself either. And somehow that made me feel closer to him than I had in years. Because it wasn't a promise, it was an admission. And sometimes those are stronger than promises. I started writing again. Journaling, mostly. Trying to understand how I'd arrived at a place where I could watch my marriage bend under the weight of something I could have stopped. I wrote about silence, about intuition, about how easily we ignore the things that make us uncomfortable. In the name of keeping the peace, one day I left my journal open on the table. He read it, not all of it, just a page. He came into the room later with red-rimmed eyes and simply said, "Thank you for not walking away." And I said, "I almost did. We're still figuring it out." Some days are good, others are harder. There are moments when we laugh and touch, and I forget anything ever happened. And there are moments when we fall quiet at dinner, lost in our own thoughts, and I remember everything too vividly, but we're still here, and I'm starting to realize that maybe the real betrayal wasn't just about Sarah or Jason or what almost happened between them. It was about all the little ways we stopped showing up for each other before that weekend ever began. And maybe, just maybe, this is our chance to start again. Summer arrived slowly that year. The kind of long, warm days that make everything feel a little softer, a little slower, but not for us. We were still walking through something dense, like wading chest deep in water. Every movement forward took effort. Every conversation still had an edge. Michael started doing small things again, fixing the leaky faucet, folding my laundry, leaving my favorite mug clean on the counter. Not grand gestures, but consistent ones, I noticed. I didn't always respond, but I noticed we still slept in the same bed, but often with our backs turned. There were nights I'd lie awake and think about that weekend like it was a dream. But then I'd hear him shift beside me and it would all come rushing back. The realness of it, the intimacy that had been stolen not just between him, Sarah, but between me and him. One night, I whispered, "Do you still think about her?" He didn't pretend not to understand. He answered quietly, "Sometimes, but not in the way you think." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know if the memory of her brought him pain or longing. I just turned over and faced the wall, and we didn't speak again until morning. Trust isn't something you just flip back on like a light switch. It returns like sunlight after a storm, hesitantly in patches, never quite sure if it's safe. We went away that August, just for 3 days. A small Airbnb by a lake, a place with no television and bad phone service. At first, the silence between us felt worse without distractions. But something happened on that second night. After a long day of doing nothing but sitting by the water. We shared a bottle of wine, sat barefoot on the wooden porch. Michael looked over and said, "I think I started looking for someone else because I didn't know how to look at you anymore. I didn't expect honesty like that, not so blunt. Not so vulnerable," he added. "You weren't gone." And I felt something in me unclench, because I'd spent so long wondering what I did wrong, wondering if I'd been cold or distant or boring. I carried all that like armor, but hearing him take responsibility, truly take it, was like setting that armor down. Not because everything was fixed, but because I wasn't the only one holding the weight anymore. That night, we made love for the first time in months. It wasn't passionate or perfect. It was awkward, uncertain, quiet, but it was real. And when it was over, we lay tangled in the sheets, holding each other, both of us crying a little. Neither of us saying why. I don't think either of us needed to dot after that trip. Something shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. We started touching more. Holding hands in the car again, sitting beside each other on the couch instead of at opposite ends. We laughed again, cautiously at first, and then freely. I stopped checking his phone. I stopped thinking about Sarah every time he looked away. There were still hard moments. Days when the memory of it all came rushing back. Sometimes triggered by something ridiculous, a joke that reminded me of her laugh, or seeing someone who looked vaguely like Jason in the grocery store. But those moments became smaller, softer, around the edges, easier to sit with. I forgave him slowly. Not with one decision, but with 1,000 tiny ones. Every time I chose not to bring it up. Every time I chose to believe him when he said he was working late. Every time I chose to stay and somewhere along the way, I forgave myself too for not stopping it sooner, for letting them stay, for ignoring my instincts, for wanting to be wanted. We started calling it before and after. Before that weekend, we were two people going through the motions. After, we were two people who had seen the edge and decided not to fall off. We rebuilt our marriage with no blueprint. Just trial and error, patience, humility, more honesty than either of us had ever dared to speak before. And love, not the kind that comes with flowers and sweeping gestures, but the kind that stays. The kind that chooses again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. One morning, nearly a year after they stayed, I walked into the kitchen and found Michael cooking breakfast. He looked up, smiled gently, and said, "You're still here." And I nodded. "I am." Would you like me to continue their story even further, perhaps into the future, years later, when the past becomes just one chapter of a much longer book? Months turned into a year, and the sting of betrayal began to dull, but it never fully disappeared. It was like a scar, sometimes tender, sometimes numb, but always there beneath the surface. We learned how to live with it, how to carry it without letting it define us. Michael started going to therapy, first alone, then with me. Sitting across from a stranger and admitting all the things he'd hidden from himself was terrifying for him, but it was necessary. I saw him break down, angry and ashamed. And I saw a flicker of hope, too, the possibility that he could change, that we could grow from the wreckage. I went too, for myself, to untangle the mix of grief, anger, and confusion swirling inside me, to understand what I wanted, what I deserved, to find my voice again. We learned how to communicate without breaking each other, to express our fears without turning them into accusations. Sometimes the progress felt like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But the steps were there. One afternoon, Michael came home with a small bouquet of wildflowers, picked from the side of the road near his office. He didn't say anything, just handed them to me and waited. I looked at the faded petals, the imperfect stems, and realized it wasn't about the flowers. It was about the gesture, the effort, the willingness to show up. I smiled, really smiled, and kissed him. We started rebuilding traditions, creating new memories that didn't carry the weight of the past. Movie nights, lazy Sunday mornings, dinners cooked together, even that awkward dance in the kitchen when a favorite song came on. But the old wounds weren't always quiet. One evening, after a long day, I found a text on Michael's phone, a name I didn't recognize. A message that seemed innocent, but sparked a familiar ache. My heart clenched, and the walls I'd slowly dismantled threatened to rise again. I didn't explode. I didn't demand explanations right away. Instead, I waited until he was home, sat beside him, and showed him the screen. "Who is this?" I asked, voice steady but fragile. Michael looked surprised, then serious. "It's just a coworker. We were planning a work lunch." I nodded, but the doubt lingered. "Can you show me what else you two talked about?" He hesitated but then unlocked the phone. We read through the messages together. Nothing inappropriate, just friendly, work-related chatter. It wasn't the text that hurt. It was the old fear of betrayal sneaking back in. We talked that night for hours about trust and boundaries and the fear that lingered beneath the surface. It was uncomfortable but necessary. That night, we promised each other something important: to keep our hearts open, but to protect them fiercely too. To never let silence or secrets grow between us again. Sometimes, I wondered if our love was fragile or if it had grown stronger because it had been tested so brutally. Maybe it was both. What I knew for certain was that letting his coworkers stay was the moment everything changed. Not because of the betrayal itself, but because it forced us to face truths we'd ignored for too long. And in the aftermath, we discovered something unexpected, a new kind of intimacy, born from vulnerability and forgiveness. Our marriage wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was ours. And sometimes, when I catch Michael looking at me with a softness that wasn't there before, I know we're still here, still fighting, still healing, still choosing each other every day. Because that's what love really is. Not the easy parts, not the shiny beginnings, but the messy, complicated middle, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough.